Welcome to the third component on my series on places. And in this, we'll discuss further how the narratives evolved and developed to explain how Europeans came to dominate the world and justify their domination. Various European thinkers and philosophers began to try to make sense of how it was that some European nations seemed to have an advantage over other nations. Some European-based empires seem to have a greater vigor and energy than other empires, and in fact, some of the older land-based empires seem to gradually deteriorate and lose their vigor, shall we say, over time. And a lot of this began to be attributed to what was considered to be racial characteristics. And in fact, a myth developed about a superior race called the Aryans. The Aryan myth was originally the product of German linguists and philologists who in the late 18th and early 19th century began to see connections between language, here again, words and narratives, and racial characteristics. In 1808, Friedrich Schlegel declared that Sanskrit was the language of the Aryan race and the parent of the Indo-European languages. This myth continued to evolve among German thinkers and eventually spread to England and America, seeking to link language to a form of social Darwinism when races were hierarchically assessed in terms of their cultural achievements, including linguistic complexity, brain size, religion, military prowess, and intelligence. So if there was an original medieval concept of the chain of being, God down through humans to other animals and so on, there eventually began to be a sort of social Darwinistic perception of a chain of being, of superior civilizations to inferior civilizations, and indeed the Aryan myth seemed to fit that goal to find out and sort and organize and explain all this. Particularly among some British thinkers who had already begun to penetrate India and even move further north, approaching Tibet, which was a particular form of fascination for them because in Tibet you began to have the confluence of the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, and the British Empire. But nevertheless, among some people, particularly as I say, British travelers and thinkers, it was assumed that the Aryans, from somewhere north of Tibet and so on, had migrated into Europe and therefore provided the initial, shall we say, ingredients necessary for superior civilizations, superior European civilizations, to evolve. By 1900, the spaces on the map, the blank places that were full of potentiality but not particularly well organized, had been acquired and claimed, and at least in the minds of European imperialists, organized into some more rational and orderly organization of the globe. In this instance, you can see that the Western Europeans, particularly Great Britain and France, claimed most of the previously unorganized spaces and so on. And therefore, they began to justify their ability to do so on the basis of what they considered to be superior racial characteristics. One of the people who was formidably responsible for changing the narratives Europeans had about wildernesses and places and spaces and so on was John Ruskin, who was the leading English art critic of the Victorian era. But he was much more than that. He was also a philosopher and a commentator on virtually all aspects of society in the Victorian world. He commented that a landscape painter must be capable of experiencing those exquisite and refined emotions which nature can arouse in a highly intellectual mind. He insisted that there was a direct relationship between natural landscape and natural morality, and that society's appreciation of landscape was a direct indication of its level of civilization. Meanwhile, basically simultaneously and in the United States, John Muir began to have similar attitudes and views towards the natural landscape. John Muir was perhaps America's most famous and influential naturalist. If it weren't for John Muir and his writings, we probably would not have Yosemite National Park as we know it today. He was involved in the creation of Grand Canyon National Park, Kings Canyon National Park, the Petrified National Park, and Mount Rainier National Park. From left to right, we have Yosemite National Park, Mount Rainier National Park, and Grand Canyon National Park. All of these were directly or indirectly a result of John Muir's lifetime effort at preservation of the natural beauty and the uncorrupted wilderness. John Muir once said that going to the mountains was going home for mankind, suggesting that our origins and our true home and place was uncorrupted nature. He advocated for the creation of national parks as the medicine for the cure of urban maladies caused by people cramming themselves into urban canyons. Basically, simultaneously, within those very urban spaces as they were growing and developing in America and elsewhere in the world, there was a sense of loss and a desire to somehow recapture some experiences with nature. So on July 21st, 1853, the New York State Legislature enacted into law setting aside of more than 750 acres of land central to Manhattan to create America's first major landscaped public park. They would soon refer to it as the Central Park. Many socially conscious reformers understood that the creation of a great public park would improve public health and contribute greatly to the formation of civil society. Immediately, the success of Central Park fostered the urban park movement, one of the greatest hallmarks of democracy of 19th century America. But the human desire to bring order out of chaos continued, and Americans continued to impose their views upon the spaces and places of their nation. Out in the West, the Native Americans were still assigned places called Indian reservations. And over time, those reservations shrunk, became smaller and smaller as civilization encroached further and further upon their world. Eventually, those Indian reservations became pockets of poverty and places where Native Americans had very difficult lives as they struggled to find the balance between their traditional cultures and the pressures of the modern civilized world. So, thank you very much for paying attention to and participating in this series on places. Please use your hearts and minds for good and useful purposes, and please stay safe and healthy. I look forward to working with you in future lessons.